I never thought a simple favor for my best friend would flip my whole world. I got a call from Jake, my ride or die since high school, saying he was sick and needed me to cover for him at his place. "Bro, just cover for me tonight. My girl thinks I'm at home sick," he said, in that rushed tone I'd heard 100 times before. I agreed without a second thought, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. An hour later, I get a text from his girlfriend. "Hey, is Jake with you?" He's not answering. I wasn't sure what to make of it, so I started texting back, asking for details. But before I could reply, another message popped up from an unknown number. "You have no idea what he's really doing. Check your front door." I bolted to the door and found a small package on my welcome mat. My heart was pounding as I picked it up. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was Jake's wallet. It was a standard wallet, but something was off. There were unmistakable splatters of blood on it. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? My phone buzzed again with another text. "This is just the beginning." I knew I had to get to the bottom of it, but the night was already spiraling out of control. I spent the next hour retracing every call and message from Jake, trying to figure out if he'd been playing a dangerous game or if something else was up. I called his number, but it went straight to voicemail. I decided to head over to his usual hangout spot, a dive bar on the edge of town, hoping I could pick up some clues from his crew. As soon as I walked in, I got the look, like everyone knew something I didn't. I asked around casually, "Hey, you seen Jake tonight?" Most shrugged it off, but one of the guys, Ricky, leaned in and said, "Man, Jake's been acting off lately. You might want to check your texts, bro." Ricky's tone wasn't angry. It was like he was trying to warn me. Leaving the bar, I drove back home, the events replaying in my head. I sat at my kitchen table, wallet in hand, and examined it. Inside, aside from the usual cards and cash, there was a crumpled piece of paper with a scribbled address and a time, 11 o'clock p.m. It looked like a meeting point. My gut told me Jake was mixed up in something way deeper than a simple lie about being sick. I decided I'd go there, even though I wasn't sure what I'd find. I hopped in my car and headed to the address, which turned out to be an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I parked a few blocks away, watching the building from a distance. The place was lit by flickering streetlights, and I could see a few silhouettes moving inside. I parked, grabbed my phone, and texted Jake's number one more time, but still nothing. I took a deep breath, reminding myself I was just following the facts. I got out, crept to the side door, and peered in. I heard muffled voices and the clink of metal. I knew this wasn't just a random meeting. Before I could decide whether to confront whoever was inside, I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a guy in a hoodie approaching fast. "You lost, man?" he said in a low tone. I didn't answer. The guy glanced at me, then at the warehouse, and without another word, melted into the shadows. That was my cue to slip away and circle back later. I drove home with a knot in my stomach, my mind racing with possibilities. Had Jake gotten himself tangled up with some dangerous crowd? Was he involved in something illegal? Every text, every clue, was a piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve but now had to. Over the next few days, I dug deeper. I started with small calls to mutual friends, asking subtle questions about Jake's whereabouts and recent behavior. One friend mentioned that Jake had been spending time with a new group of guys who were known for their shady business. Another friend said he'd overheard Jake talking about a job he was supposed to complete soon. No one knew exactly what it was, but the tone was all business, no nonsense. I began to piece together a timeline. Jake had been in a steady relationship, but over the past few weeks, he'd been acting erratic, missing appointments, and dodging calls. It seemed like he was in deep, and he'd chosen me, knowingly or not, to be part of his cover. I decided to visit Jake's apartment, hoping to find some answers. I knew he wouldn't let me in without a fight, but I was determined. I rang the doorbell, and after a few rings, the door opened just a crack. I saw his girlfriend, Lisa, on the other side. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky. I told her straight up that I was looking for Jake and needed to know what was going on. Lisa hesitated before letting me in. Once inside, I looked around for any clues. A phone, notes, anything that could explain why Jake's wallet had blood on it. Lisa sat down at the kitchen counter and started talking in a monotone. "Jake's been different. I don't know if he's in trouble or if he's playing some kind of game. Last week he came home late and was all jittery. Then he started getting calls from unknown numbers like the one you got. I thought it was just some prank, but tonight was different." I pressed her for details. She said that a couple of nights ago, Jake had left a sealed envelope on his desk with an address and a time, much like the one I'd found in his wallet. Lisa admitted she'd tried to call him, but he'd said it was a work thing. Nothing in her tone suggested he was involved in something dangerous, but his behavior told a different story. After talking with Lisa, I decided it was time to go back to that warehouse. I needed to see what was really happening inside. The night I chose was cloudy, and the warehouse loomed like a ghost in the dark. I parked a few blocks away again, and this time I approached the building more confidently. I remembered the layout from my previous pass by, and found a side entrance that was slightly ajar. I slipped in quietly. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. I moved slowly, sticking to the shadows. I could hear voices coming from a large room at the end of a long corridor. When I reached the room, I saw a group of men gathered around a table, all dressed in dark clothes, discussing something in hushed, urgent tones. One of them had a smartphone in hand, playing a video that I couldn't make out, but the tension in the room was palpable. I edged closer and caught bits of conversation. Jake's name was mentioned several times. They were talking about the delivery and ensuring the operation runs smoothly. Every detail was a direct hit to the mystery. I realized then that Jake was involved in something much bigger than I'd imagined. I retreated silently, my mind reeling with the new information. The next morning, I began piecing together a timeline from everything I'd overheard and from conversations with Jake's friends and Lisa. It turned out that Jake had been working as a courier of sorts, a middleman between two groups, one that dealt in high-stakes smuggling and another that was trying to take them down. He'd been promised a large payout if he delivered a particular package without drawing attention. That package was the wallet I'd found, which apparently was a container for critical evidence. The blood on it wasn't random, it was there because something had gone wrong during a drop-off. Jake's role had shifted from being a simple errand boy to being a key player in a dangerous game. I made some calls to an old contact from way back, someone who who used to work in law enforcement. I needed to know if the police had any reports about a missing courier or any similar incidents. My contact confirmed that there had been a few reports of suspicious activities involving middlemen in smuggling rings, but nothing concrete that pointed directly to Jake. Still, his involvement was clear to me. I decided to visit the scene where the wallet had been delivered, hoping to find more clues. That area was a rough part of town, filled with abandoned buildings and flickering streetlights. I combed through the area and noticed fresh tire tracks leading away from my doorstep. They matched a pattern I'd seen on a nearby service van, a van that belonged to a local transport company known to be a front for illicit operations. I spent the next couple of days tailing the van, keeping a safe distance while noting every detail, the time it left, the stops it made, and the people who got on and off. It was a tedious job, but I was driven by the need for answers. The van made several stops at warehouses and secluded lots. Each time I recorded the license plate and noted the faces of the drivers as best as I could. I even managed to snap a few photos discreetly. One night, while the van was parked near an industrial park, I decided to follow one of the drivers on foot. I kept my distance, moving through the dark alleys until I reached a rundown building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Inside, I found more evidence, a ledger with dates, names, and a series of coded transactions. I managed to memorize some details before I had to retreat as footsteps approached. Back at my place, I sat down and started connecting the dots. Jake's wallet, the anonymous texts, Lisa's half-truths, the warehouse meeting, and the van operations all pointed to one conclusion. Jake had been deep in the middle of a smuggling ring, and his sick excuse was just a cover for his secret life. I decided I had to confront him directly. I remembered that Jake had mentioned meeting a guy named Tony at a location downtown. I figured that meeting might hold the key to everything. I arranged to be at that spot at the time Jake was supposed to be there. I parked nearby and waited, checking my phone every few minutes. Around 11:15 p.m., a figure appeared, a tall guy with a leather jacket and an unyielding stare. I recognized him as Tony from the few pictures I'd seen of Jake's contacts online. Tony looked around nervously and then noticed me. He smirked, and before I could say anything, he pulled out his phone and texted someone. I didn't catch the message, but it was enough to set off alarm bells. Tony left quickly, and I followed him at a distance. The chase led me through busy streets and quiet back alleys until he finally stopped at an upscale bar that seemed out of place for someone like him. I waited outside, watching through the window. Inside, Tony was in a heated conversation with a man I didn't recognize, a suited guy with cold eyes who looked like he was in charge. I listened in as best as I could from the glass. They mentioned a meeting, a shipment, and a deadline. Tony was clearly nervous about the operation. When they parted ways, I decided it was time to act. I knew I had to warn Jake, or at least figure out where he was heading. I called Lisa again, and this time she was more cooperative. She admitted that Jake had hinted at a big job that could set him up for life, and that he'd been receiving threats from people he couldn't pay off. Lisa didn't know if he was in danger, or if he was dangerous himself, but she urged me to be careful. I promised I would, and after hanging up, I went back to my car. I decided that the next step was to intercept Jake directly. I drove to a known meeting point for the courier network, a deserted lot near the docks. There, I found a mix of abandoned cars and a few shady figures milling around. I parked my car a safe distance away and waited. At 11:45 p.m., I saw Jake approaching slowly. He was alone and on edge, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. I stepped out of the shadows and confronted him. "Jake, what the hell is going on?" I demanded. He froze for a moment, then sighed, resigned. "All right, man, you gotta chill," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm in deep, too deep. I needed to cover for a job, and it got out of hand." He started explaining, and as he spoke, I pieced together the real story. Jake had been roped into smuggling a package that contained critical evidence against a dangerous syndicate. The wallet wasn't just a container, it was a signal that something had gone wrong during the drop-off, and the blood was from a rival who tried to intercept it. The anonymous texts were a warning from someone within the ring who wasn't happy with the way things were going. Jake told me he'd gotten cold feet when he realized the risk, but then he found himself unable to back out. The more he tried to extricate himself, the deeper he sank. He tried to cover for the job by lying about being sick, but once the texts started coming in, he knew it was too late. "I didn't plan for any of this, man. I thought I could handle it, but now I'm in way over my head," he admitted. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion, just cold facts. I pressed him for details. Who was behind it, what the shipment was worth, and if he had any idea who was sending the texts. Jake said he wasn't sure about all the names, but he mentioned Tony and another guy named Marco. Tony was clearly the middleman, and Marco was supposedly one of the enforcers. The conversation was interrupted when a black SUV pulled up near the lot. Two men in dark suits stepped out and started scanning the area. I told Jake to hide, and he bolted towards a stack of shipping containers. The guys in the SUV split up. One went towards the container where Jake had disappeared, and the other circled around. I ducked behind a car, my mind racing with the implications. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also knew that if I left Jake behind, I'd be part of this mess forever. I stayed low, watching as the suited man approached the container. A tense few minutes passed. I couldn't hear their conversation, only the heavy breathing and distant sounds of the city. Finally, the man left, and Jake emerged, shaken but alive. After that encounter, Jake and I huddled in his car, trying to figure out our next move. "Listen, I gotta finish this job, but I can't do it alone," Jake said. "I need you to help me deliver the package and get the evidence to someone who can take down these clowns." I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore, but I was already in too deep. I agreed, and we set a plan in motion. Our next stop was an abandoned warehouse where an old friend of Jake's, someone with connections in the underground network, was waiting to meet him. We drove through dark, empty streets until we reached the location. The warehouse was nearly deserted, save for a few people who looked like they'd been there for hours. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and businesslike. Jake handed over the package to a burly man with a scar across his cheek. "This is it," Jake said in a low voice. The man nodded, counted the contents, and then motioned for Jake to follow him into a back room. I lingered outside, keeping an eye on the entrance. Minutes later, I saw Jake and the man leave in a different car. I trailed them at a distance, using every bit of caution caution I had. They drove to an industrial park on the edge of the city. There, I witnessed a covert handoff between the burly man and a suited figure I hadn't seen before. The exchange was brief, a nod, a quick conversation, and then the suited man left with the evidence. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Jake, but he didn't answer. I was left with a mix of frustration and worry. The next morning, I retraced my steps and visited the industrial park again. I managed to find a discarded phone on the ground near where the exchange had occurred. It was unlocked, and when I skimmed through it, I found a series of texts between the suited man and an unknown number. They discussed the shipment, the timing, and the need to move quickly. One text mentioned eliminating the loose ends, which made it clear that whoever was behind this operation wasn't messing around. I forwarded the text to my contact in law enforcement, who told me to lay low and let them handle it. I couldn't do that though. I had to know what happened to Jake. Over the next few days, I visited a series of locations connected to Jake's trail. I went to a rundown motel he'd stayed at a week ago, where I found receipts and a map with several marked locations. One location was a safe house in a suburban neighborhood, where I managed to peek through a window and see a group of guys packing boxes. Everything pointed to a larger operation than I'd ever imagined. I started documenting everything, taking notes and photos, and trying to form a timeline of events. Every piece of evidence confirmed one thing: Jake was caught between two worlds. A criminal network that dealt in smuggling evidence, and a law enforcement crackdown that was closing in fast. I contacted another old buddy from college, Mark, who now worked in security for a private investigation firm. Mark was skeptical at first, but when I laid out the facts, he agreed to help me piece together the puzzle. We spent long hours in a diner, going over every detail, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. Mark had access to security footage from the industrial park, and even some surveillance from the warehouse meeting. The images confirmed that Jake had met with Tony, and that he'd been seen at multiple locations that night. Mark's calm, methodical approach contrasted with my own adrenaline-fueled panic, and together we mapped out the connections between the players involved. One late night, while I was reviewing our notes at home, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A gruff voice said, "You shouldn't be digging into things you don't understand, man." I asked, "Who is this?" The voice replied, "Consider this a warning. Back off or you'll get hurt." I hung up, feeling the weight of the threat. This wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about a dangerous organization that didn't want anyone interfering. I realized that if I wanted to get out alive, I had to be smarter and move faster. I decided to confront Jake one more time. I found him at a local diner where he'd been hiding out. When I sat across from him, I didn't mince words. "Jake, you dragged me into this mess. I need to know, who's behind all this?" Jake looked tired, his eyes bloodshot. "I'm in too deep, man. Tony's the middleman, but there's a bigger fish behind it all. I can't even say his name. All I know is that he controls the whole operation, and if you cross him, you're done for." I pressed him for more details, but he only shrugged. "I got a meeting with him tomorrow. That's it." I asked if I should come along, but he shook his head. "No way. This is my problem. Just trust me and stay out of it." I didn't feel like I had a choice. The next morning, I stayed home, watching the news and checking my phone for updates. Nothing came in until late afternoon, when I received a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old pier at 8 p.m. I have answers." My gut told me it was risky, but I needed to know what was really going on with Jake. I arrived at the pier, an isolated stretch of concrete with minimal lighting. A lone figure stood waiting, a woman in a dark coat. She didn't offer any pleasantries. She got straight to business. "I'm Agent Reynolds," she said curtly. "I work with a task force on organized crime. We've been tracking this operation for months, and I know Jake. He wasn't an active player. He was a pawn." I listened as she laid out the facts. The wallet with blood was a setup designed to frame Jake as a rogue element, and the texts were part of a misinformation campaign to confuse law enforcement and rivals alike. Jake had been caught in the crossfire. Agent Reynolds explained that her team had intercepted communications between Tony and the higher-ups in the syndicate. They were planning a major exchange that would shift the balance of power in the criminal underworld. Jake's role had been minimized after his initial involvement, and now he was in danger of being eliminated by both sides. "We need someone on the inside who can confirm his whereabouts and status," she said, her tone blunt. I agreed to help, realizing that my actions could tip the scales either way. She handed me a secure phone and some documents that detailed the operation's logistics. Everything was laid out in stark, factual terms: meeting times, locations, names, and coded references to shipments. I spent the next few hours reviewing the documents, cross-checking the details with my own notes from the previous nights. The picture that emerged was grim. Tony was planning to meet with the syndicate's head at a location far from the city, an old warehouse near the docks. The plan was to transfer a massive amount of evidence that would implicate several high-ranking officials in a web of corruption and criminal activity. I texted Agent Reynolds that I'd be watching that warehouse, and she instructed me to relay any information immediately. That night, I parked a few blocks away from the docks and set up a small observation post in my car. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. Hours passed slowly until, just before midnight, I saw a convoy of vehicles pull up. It was exactly as the documents had indicated. I watched as men in suits and dark clothing moved between the vehicles and the warehouse. I recorded everything on my phone, knowing that every second was crucial. At one point, I saw Jake, looking disheveled and clearly scared, slip into the building. I couldn't do much except record his presence, my heart pounding with the weight of the situation. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. I could hear muffled voices and the sound of footsteps echoing in the vast space. I listened as a man, presumably Tony, barked orders. "We move at 1 a.m. sharp. No mistakes." The others responded with curt nods and brief affirmations. The operation was about to unfold. I sent all the recorded evidence to Agent Reynolds, along with a detailed report of what I'd observed. She replied almost immediately, "Stay put. Backup is on the way." What happened next was a blur. The operation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of sirens and flashing blue lights. The warehouse erupted into chaos as both the syndicate's men and the police converged on the location. I watched from my car as the suited man I had seen earlier was tackled by officers. In the confusion, I saw Jake darting out of the warehouse, bleeding and in shock. I parked quickly and followed him on foot, keeping a safe distance. I caught up to him in a narrow alleyway behind behind the docks. He was leaning against a wall, gasping for air, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Jake, what happened?" I asked, keeping my tone blunt. He looked at me with a mix of relief and resignation. "They knew, man. They knew all along. I was just a scapegoat, a pawn in their game." Jake recounted everything in a monotone fashion. Every step he had taken, every lie he'd told, and every threat he'd received. He explained that the entire setup had been orchestrated by someone higher up in the syndicate to ensure that any loose ends were taken care of once the evidence was handed over. His involvement was always meant to be temporary, a means to an end. As he spoke, I realized that what I had assumed was a straightforward case of a friend in trouble was actually a deep-seated operation that spanned multiple layers of organized crime and corruption. The aftermath was a mess. The police managed to detain several key players, including Tony, but the higher-ups remained elusive. Agent Reynolds later informed me that Jake had entered a witness protection program in exchange for his testimony against the syndicate. The evidence I'd gathered played a crucial role in launching a full-scale investigation, and while it didn't solve all the problems overnight, it was a start. I stayed in touch with Agent Reynolds, providing any additional details I remembered, and slowly the case unfolded in courtrooms and behind closed doors. In the end, the operation was dismantled piece by piece. The syndicate's head, whose name remained under wraps, was arrested, along with several mid-level operatives. Jake's role was recognized as that of a small cog in a giant machine, and his cooperation with the authorities helped bring down a network that had operated in the shadows for years. I learned that sometimes the smallest decisions, like agreeing to cover for a friend, can have ripple effects that change everything. I also realized that loyalty comes with a cost, and sometimes you have to pay a high price to get to the truth. Looking back, I can't say that the journey was worth the pain or the danger, but it taught me to never take things at face value. Every fact, every detail, played its part in unraveling a much larger conspiracy. I'm still left with questions about how deep the corruption goes and who else might be out there, lurking in the shadows of our everyday lives. But for now, I can only report the facts as I saw them. A series of events that began with a simple favor, spiraled into a labyrinth of deceit and danger, and finally, led to a resolution that, while not perfect, brought some measure of justice. As I wrap up this chapter, I'm aware that life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One night, a text, a package, and a seemingly routine favor turned everything upside down. In the end, the truth came out, and the people behind the scheme were brought to account. It wasn't a neat story with clear heroes and villains, just a tangled web of facts, mistakes, and desperate choices made under pressure. And while the scars remain, they also serve as a reminder that even when you're caught in a seemingly endless spiral, you can still find a way out by sticking to the facts and doing what's right, even if it costs you everything. The whole ordeal has left me with a hardened perspective on trust and loyalty, but also with a strange sense of relief that the chaos finally subsided. I'm still processing the fallout, but one thing's for sure, I'll never look at a favor the same way again. Every call, every text, every decision now carries the weight of what happened that night. The night everything changed. The night I learned that sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any lie. In the end, the operation might have been dismantled, and the syndicate's power broken, but the ripple effects continue to impact lives long after the case is closed. For Jake, his testimony and cooperation have given him a chance at redemption, albeit from a distance. For me, I've learned that diving into someone else's secrets can lead you down a path you can't easily walk back from. And as I sit here, writing these final words, I know that the city is full of stories like mine. Stories of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, where every fact matters, and every decision can change everything. That's the cold, hard truth of it. No frills, no extra fluff, just a series of events that spiraled out of control and eventually found some semblance of order in the chaos. I've been through it all, and now I can finally say that even when you're in the middle of an endless spiral, there's always a way to break free. And sometimes, the most unexpected favor is the one that sets everything in motion. It's over now, but the lessons remain. Stay sharp, keep your eyes open, and never trust a text from an unknown number. That's how it all went down, plain and simple.